Have you spent a significant amount of time living outside your passport country during your developmental years? Do you come from an expat, military, diplomat, missionary, or international business family background? If so, then this podcast is for you.
Welcome to the TCK Research Podcast, where we discuss the current state of research on third culture kids, cross-culture kids, expat families, and international life in general.
My name is Andrea Schmidt, and I've been an expat for over 30 years, having lived in a total of 9 countries. I'm a coach for TCK girls, and I'm currently completing my master's degree in psychology.
And I'm Mathieu Gagnon, an adult third culture kid who grew up in 6 countries until the age of 15. And I'm now a professor of psychology in Ontario, Canada.
Every episode, we bring you a fascinating conversation with a leading researcher in the field.
If you're listening on YouTube or another platform, please subscribe to our channel. And if you enjoyed this episode, please press the thumbs up or like button, share it on your social media platforms, or send it to a friend.
If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can reach us at tckresearchpod@gmail.com.
Let's jump right in.
Enjoy the podcast.
Today's guest is Brooke Berndtson. Brooke has a rich academic background that includes philosophy, child and adolescent mental health, and disability services in higher education, with degrees from Stetson University, University of Oxford, University of Edinburgh, and the CUNY School of Professional Studies. As a dual American-Greek citizen living in France, she works at the intersection of mental health, disability, and transcultural education, supporting students in both secondary and higher education in Paris. She also sits on the board of the European Association for Study Abroad and serves on the Health and Wellness Committee for l'Association des Programmes Universitaires Américains en France, supporting policies and practices that promote a healthy, inclusive environment for both students and institutional staff. And today, we're talking about her master's thesis entitled Foreign in Any Society: Cross-Cultural Transition, Adaptation, and Identity in Autistic Third Culture Kids. Welcome, everybody, to this new episode of the TCK Research Podcast. Today, we say hello to Brooke Berndtson. Hi, Brooke. How are you?
Hello, I'm doing well. How about you?
Good. I'm good as well. You're calling in from...
I'm
Where are you
calling in
calling
from Paris, steps from the Opera Garnier.
Ooh, Paris. If I can name drop a city or
Okay,
city
here we
drop,
go.
that's the city of my birth. That's where I was born.
Oh, there you go. There you go.
Andrea, you are calling in from
Cancun, Mexico. And you, Mathieu?
Cancun, from Kingston, Ontario. And so, once again, lovely audience, listeners, and viewers, this is a tri-country, tri-national thing that's going on here that we bring to you. So, Brooke, we wanted to bring you on because you did a wonderful piece of scholarship related to the autism experience in the context of the third culture kid, um, kind of third culture kid space. Before we start talking about that, though, we like to get a sense of what the guests' own TCK or expat story or experience is. So, what's your own TCK or expat experience?
So I am not a TCK, which I like to clarify. I would be more what Van Ricken calls a cross-culture kid, which is somebody who has had a meaningful engagement with multiple cultures throughout their developmental years. So I'm a dual national. I grew up in a family with Greek heritage. I also grew up in a home where I experienced all 3 Abrahamic faiths. So I have always had an interest in kind of intercultural and cross-cultural studies as it relates to trying to make sense of myself, understanding who I am, my identity, how that shifts between spaces and has changed over time.
Mm,
So I'm not quite TCK in the sense that TCKs are not voluntarily moved. And I think that's a really important distinguishing feature.
mm.
I went abroad as an adult, first as a heritage learner to try to connect more closely to Greek culture. And then I went abroad for my studies in England. I worked briefly in Tanzania, and now I've been in
Oh, wow.
France for 11 years. So
Mm,
all of those experiences happened as voluntary migrations in my adulthood. And for TCKs, there is movement, but that movement is not necessarily initiated by you. And so I think that's an important distinguishing factor in our experiences.
Hmm.
hmm Cool. Right. I didn't, so Tanzania, France, those are very different. Wow, very
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And let's go to our first question regarding your study. The objectives of your study were to explore the lived experiences of autistic third culture kids, focusing on how cross-cultural transitions and adaptation during their developmental years, so from age 0 to 18, influence the development of their identity and well-being. This is the very first study to focus on autistic TCKs, and you yourself are a late diagnosed autistic woman with high mobility, as you've just explained. Can you tell us how this influenced the study?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of ways that it influenced the study, one of them being personal, just in my personal motivation
Mhm.
and curiosity about this experience. I also predominantly work in international and transnational spaces, and so I was encountering a lot of other people, and I started to think, okay, I'm meeting a lot of
Right.
autistic internationals. And so I had just questions that started to pop up for myself and also in making sense of my own experiences moving
Mhm.
abroad. I think also in the context of COVID, which was really like a revelatory experience. And in that space, really allowed me to do a lot of reflection and thinking on my own identity and
Mhm.
experience, and lack of mentorship and modeling. And it became very important for me to be open about my diagnosis.
Yeah.
Whereas before, this was something that, selective disclosure is really important. We have to acknowledge the different power structures and people's biases and
Yeah.
stereotyping and stigma. But it was a kind of liberation for me,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
I wanted to shine a light on the communities that I was working within, and especially for people who really weren't feeling able to come out or were hesitant about it for whatever reason. And there's lots of
Mhm.
very valid reasons to not be upfront about a diagnosis.
Yeah,
But
of
I will
course.
say that there was such a high number of people that I was coming into contact with who, because I was open, uh, would disclose to me.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I
Hmm.
started to think maybe we're not seeing the full story here or
Yeah.
something is missing. And
Hmm.
so that was a kind of personal drive for me to further investigate.
Hmm.
Um, and then, from a methodological perspective, of course, we have to talk about bias and that, we tend to have this idea that the closer that someone is to the experience, the less objective they can be, which is
Hmm.
also why I really liked the interpretive phenomenological analysis as the
Yeah.
methodology, because I feel that this is the most explicit about um, uprooting this idea of a neutral observer,
Hmm.
Right.
and that
Mhm.
every person is coming in with their own experiences and background, and that is going to shape how they interpret the information and make sense of the stories that are being told.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And so, you know, yes, there is space for bias, but there is always space for bias the
Yeah.
position from which we look at a thing will always change how we
Mm,
see it.
mm,
And so I feel that the methodology leaves space for this and acknowledges it as a part of the process,
mhm,
as opposed to being something that's inherently limited. And then I also, appreciate the idea of the double empathy problem, which is that, a lot of the times autistic people are bridging the gap or leaning in where that's not happening in that other direction. And
mm,
so I also felt that this was an advantage in terms of establishing rapport with my participants
Right.
and
Right.
making them
Yeah.
feel safe, and that
mm,
they wouldn't have to be trying to bridge that gap in
mm,
communications with me. I can
mm.
That
also
makes
admit
sense.
that there are limitations to that, and I think
Of
also having
course.
been, um, you know, an, a newer researcher in this methodology, I might have had richer qualitative results for some things if we hadn't assumed that there was already shared meaning. And so
Mm,
I'll totally
Interesting. Yeah.
admit to that, in the
yeah,
sense that because I was not an outsider,
yeah.
sometimes I didn't push as much to have my participants divulge to me how they were understanding a concept, because it was already assumed that we had
Yeah.
shared understanding of
Mm,
what
That's
this meant.
very interesting. That's a
yeah,
very
of
interesting kind of
course.
critical, self-critical thinking. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Can hold on,
okay.
hold on,
Yeah, go
Matthew,
ahead.
hold
Go
on,
ahead.
Matthew.
Go ahead,
Just one
Nadia.
question, one follow-up question. How old were you when you were diagnosed?
So I was first diagnosed in university. It was
Okay.
my third attempt at doing an undergraduate
Mm,
degree. And
Cool.
so we were
Mhm.
exploring why, even though I seemed to
Mhm.
have testing high on IQ tests,
yeah,
so
yeah,
much
yeah.
difficulty in my academics.
Mm,
Um, and at the time, which, I often think about how almost incredible it is that at the time, um, which was before we were having all of this public conversation about how we were overlooking autism in women, and
mm,
definitely before the days of social media,
yeah.
Mhm.
there was
The sweet
someone,
before social media.
someone who was able to see that despite all of the compensatory strategies that I had employed to cover it up. And so at the time, I was receiving treatment for ADHD. And
Okay.
as soon as I started taking the medication, um, my doctor was like, I'd like to actually explore some other possibilities with you. And so he didn't
Yeah,
tell me what
yeah,
he was doing, but he started to, ask me questions and how I felt about them and whether I related to them. And then at the end of it was kind of like, so surprise.
Mm, mm,
This is what at the time was called Asperger's, and in France,
yeah.
most people will still use Asperger's as
mm,
the,
Mm.
autism without intellectual disability or difficulties with language. I
okay.
was hyperverbal as a kid.
Yeah,
And so, I didn't have any of those kind of telltale
Mm,
um,
mm,
signs.
yeah.
So this was like a really big moment for
of
me.
course.
But the response to it was not great.
Oh.
So I kind of went through a very long period, over a decade of denying that this
Mm.
applied to me, because I was
Mm,
too functional, too normal, too intelligent. Although I always make the joke that my mom's first thoughts when I told her that I had been diagnosed were, "You can't be autistic, Brooke. Those kids are really smart."
Oh,
oh.
So what happens is that you encounter other people's perceptions of what
Yeah.
it
yeah,
is supposed to look like. And for some people, that's being a savant. And for some
yeah,
people, it's,
Yeah.
being a really high support needs, or
Mm,
more evident struggles, which my participants will also talk about.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a long process of me having the information and then actively trying to counteract it. And then, like I said, during the COVID period, this was a moment where we got to step away from, I mean, the lockdowns is specifically like
Yeah.
COVID still happening, but the lockdowns were really a space where I was no longer being observed. And so much of
It
the
all came, yeah,
strategies that I had been employing
came
were
crumbling
like
down. Yeah.
melting away. And I was like, oh
Yeah.
my God, I have no idea who I am. I, like,
Yeah.
and so it became really important for me. So I actually went through the diagnostic process twice. And, the second time around, I feel like I was in a much better space. And thanks to the advocacy that has, taken place since the 90s, and, the neurodiversity movement becoming more mainstream, kind of
Yeah.
allowed a space for me to step into that as an aspect of my identity and help me make sense of myself as well.
Yeah.
So that is a really long-winded way to answer your question, but like many of my participants, it actually wasn't one diagnostic story, because
It was many.
oftentimes
Yeah.
what's happening is in
Yeah.
each space that you go, you have to do it again. And
Yeah.
I did have to do it also in France. It was
Wow.
quite a fight
Of
to get
course.
my diagnosis recognized. So
Hmm.
and this is a common experience that a lot
Yeah.
of TCKs have, where even if you come with documentation, you're always sort of
Yeah.
having to go through a new administrative system, a new cultural system.
Yeah. Yeah.
And depending on their conceptualization of what autism is, you may fit or you may
Yeah.
not. And
Yeah.
so, I
Yeah.
think it really shows how our identities are not things that we possess. They are these
The
highly
broader. Yeah.
interactive,
Yes. Yes. Right.
and they're very dynamic, and they also
Hmm.
have to do a lot with how we are observed.
Right.
Of
So you
course.
mentioned
Of course.
your participants. Let's talk about a little bit about the, because you begin the thesis basically by saying that the just the notion of an autistic third culture kid causes an apparent paradox. Uh, can you share why you see this as something that people might see as a paradox between those two terms, TCK and autistic?
Yeah, I will. So I just was doing a kind of cleanup slash update of my research, because obviously as soon as you put something out, like time doesn't stop and we learn new things and
Yes. Yeah.
people
Yeah. Of
produce new works. And so I was like, there
course.
really hasn't been a lot about third culture kids and disability. So maybe something's come up. And I just found a dissertation by Sarah Farmer on special education in international schools and
Hmm.
TCK. And I thought it was great because it's so complementary actually to what is in my paper and my experience working in education, both in secondary education and in higher education, within this highly international context. And what the parents are expressing in that paper is that the institutions are just saying, we do not have those kids. So
Right.
and that really
That's fun. Yeah.
mirrors
Yeah.
my experience of, I think we do have those kids. Either we're overlooking them or they are strategically obscuring themselves. And so, I think there was just a kind of general sense that, and I got this, too, when I proposed the project. It was like, okay, but no one's going to respond to that call for participants, because
Mm.
being
Yeah.
autistic is so at odds with
Yeah.
how we conceptualize a TCK. And like I say in my study, we have all sorts of positive traits that we associate with third culture kids. And that's the open-mindedness and cognitive flexibility, cultural sensitivity, a kind of attunement to these nuanced changes between cultures and social interactions. And then from a deficit lens, looking at autism, the focus is really on that lack of adaptability, cognitive inflexibility, maybe lower levels of empathy. And so when I said, okay, but I see and interact with a lot of young people where I notice these traits, or my, coworkers and colleagues who have received their diagnoses, and I'm not seeing it as a paradox. So part of me wanted to push back on and challenge the idea that these were two totally incompatible things. And I do want to admit that I think, part of the issue is also that in a lot of these environments, we have pushed those students out. So, particularly if you are in a private institution and you have the ability to select your students and you're just saying this student isn't a fit with our community, we're sorry, we're not going to be able, and they don't have to use
accommodate
the term disability as a reason for why. They just have to say it's not, they're not going to fit in with our institution. And so,
they'd be better served elsewhere.
Yeah.
It's like we don't have the support, right? We can't provide the support.
Yeah. And I mean, that raises a lot of questions too about training and the competencies. And like I said, the dissertation that I just read goes into a lot of that.
Interesting.
The problems that the schools are encountering, that the parents are encountering, which I thought was a really good complement to, and really makes it more palpable that even from a parent perspective, they're kind of seeing the same, they're noticing the same things. I don't believe that there is an inherent contradiction, but in the way that they are described, you might think that it's not possible to be an autistic TCK.
And yet.
And yet here we are.
Here we are.
And here's Brooke to say, right.
And I was really surprised actually by how much overlap there is. Specifically this idea of TCKs are often referred to as chameleons. And then you also have masking behavior and the camouflaging. So a lot of autistic people will refer to themselves as chameleons. And so
we'll talk
I
about
think
that in
that
the context of
there are
results,
similar adaptive strategies that are being used. And I know that it makes some people uncomfortable, actually, that I have drawn these parallels. So I did have, not all that long ago, an argument with someone who works in mental health for TCKs, who was really angry at me that I was diagnosing normal TCK psychological responses as autism. And we can just bracket the fact that diagnosis isn't what I do. I'm simply talking to people who have already received a diagnosis. But there was this sense of resistance that I was pathologizing unnecessarily the TCK experience. And I think what's being missed there is actually she should be especially interested in my paper, because this might indicate that we have to do more work on doing differential diagnosis. So if you believe that we are wrongly diagnosing TCKs as autistic because there is this high overlap, then we need to be having that conversation too.
Very interesting. There's a whole series of kind of conversational spaces that this should be a series of podcasts, because it's so rich. It's
another podcast
so rich. Andrea, You want to
Yeah.
ask a question, I think, about methods, right?
Yes, I think we're gonna dive into your methods because you already mentioned the semi-structured interview that you used and the analysis that with which you interpreted your data. So can you tell us what the IPA is and why you thought it would be the best fit to explore autistic TCKs?
Yeah, so I felt that this was the best methodology to use because it's really focused on the messy human experience. Um, Oftentimes, even with qualitative data, I find it's a struggle to get people to not try to extrapolate
Mm,
general rules. But IPA is so heavily grounded in this, like, this is about the individual and the story that they're telling and how they understand their life. And it's really
mm,
about that first person perspective and their understanding and how they interpret their own experience. And
mm,
like I mentioned earlier, there's the idea of double hermeneutics, which is that, they are making sense of their experience and I'm making sense of the experience that they're telling me
mm,
simultaneously. And so I liked the fact that there was this inherent richness, which
mhm,
would allow us to look at the ways that, each person's experience is full of uncontrollable variables
mm,
Mm,
and that we are, always evolving and understanding our experiences in new ways, re-understanding it through
mhm,
reflection. And it just was so textured. And one of the things about, autism research, which again, I will say, like, there's been a big push, especially in the last decade, to correct this. But a lot of the research is really focused on ideology
mm,
and what is the source of this? And we're
yeah.
looking at, loads of quantitative research
mm,
that doesn't really capture what the individual experience is, which does a disservice because people aren't numbers. And
yeah.
it's,
Mm,
we can't really um, foster empathy for a statistic. So
mhm,
there has been a push to elevate lived experience as a form of expertise,
Mm,
which
mhm.
again goes back to that idea of challenging the neutral observer, or that if you're farther away from something, you can see it, more
More
realistically or
mm,
realistically,
without
yeah.
bias.
Hmm.
And really talk about grounding it in these individual stories. So
mhm,
I thought this makes sense within this landscape where we're asking for
mhm,
more personal stories and where we're looking
Hmm.
really to humanize those experiences
yeah.
and reduce that sense of abstraction.
Mm,
So IPA felt like the most logical way to do this
mhm,
kind of work,
yeah.
which is really just like going in and saying, I'm curious about this. What can
Hmm.
you tell me about your lived experience? And then walking away from it knowing that that's what you've got. You
Yeah.
have one person's lived experience. And
Yeah.
then, of
Right.
course, what we're looking for are ways that, those experiences converge and ways that they diverge from
Mm,
one another. And then, that can be used as a basis to do further
The
exploration.
research.
But it's
Yeah.
not here to make claims. And I'm very like, first of all, I just think science should be about humility and it's very
Hmm.
humbling. And I
Hmm.
don't want to make grandiose claims about anything that I've done because I don't
mm,
think that's the purpose. It's really about saying we're just bringing these things to the surface and we're looking at them in the light. And
Yep.
then we can develop other projects from there.
Yeah.
mm,
It's fascinating. So you interviewed six adults, right? Most of them were late diagnosed. They were
mhm,
between in their 20s and their 40s, right? And I
Mhm.
think they had lived in at least two countries for over a year before they were 18 years old, which kind of matches the minimal standards for most TCK definitions, I think. So
Mm-hmm.
these folks, you interacted with these folks and you asked them questions. Can you give us some sample questions or prompts that were part of the interview? If I'm a participant in this interview, what are you asking me exactly?
Yeah. So I asked things like, can you describe your experience of moving
Mm-hmm.
from one country to another? And then the prompts would be, can you tell me more about how you felt about that? How did you prepare for that? Did you receive any support? And it's really more about following the lead of the participant. So I don't want to do too much prompting because I want them to make sense of the question on their own.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I will say, I went back and forth about this, and I think this is just also, again, like part of the constraints of being a new researcher and of the amount of knowledge that is actually out there on these, populations. But there is some research that suggests that it's actually better to approach autistic participants with closed questions first
Oh, that's
and to
interesting. Yeah.
move to broader questions as you
Gradually
go.
moved.
And
Uh-huh.
when
Yeah.
I presented the questions originally, I was like, if you asked me this, I would just be like, what do you mean?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so I thought, okay, there might be some validity to that, but there isn't
Mm-hmm.
enough evidence out there for me to use that in my methodology because then it's going to be viewed skeptically and
Yeah.
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I'm like, all right, we'll do these really broad, open-ended questions. How do you think people perceived your autistic traits as you moved
Mm-hmm.
through each of these cultural environments? And
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
sometimes I did get like a, what are you talking about? But
Right.
it's just trying to naturally draw out without too much heavy prompting. And, this can always be improved as well.
Yeah.
Of course.
Um,
Of course. It's a skill,
but
yeah.
yeah, and I probably also shaped, some of these questions again by my own experience and things that,
Mm.
you're like, okay, they'll likely want to talk about these
Mhm.
aspects. So just
Mm.
formulating a question that kind of allows space. Like, do you think that there were, any experiences that were, useful, or are there any traits that you identify with more than another? And like,
Mm.
and allowing them
Yeah.
to build from there.
It's a
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
open kind of broad questions where the answer can be quite rich. You can get a lot of it. I
Mm.
guess that's the game, right? I want to cast a wide net to get the rich information.
And you
Yeah.
got a wide
Interesting.
range, right? So the
Yes, let's
results
move into the
showed
results. Yeah.
five main themes and three sub-themes each. So going through the sub-themes
I
is a little bit maybe too detailed, but the five big themes were cultural camouflage, destabilization transitions, coping and collapse, then late diagnosis, including grief acceptance and healing, and autistic TCK advantages. So if we go through them one by one. In theme one, cultural camouflage, you reflect on how TCK identity can actually obscure autism. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
yeah, so essentially, a lot of my participants felt that they would not have been diagnosed later in life
Mm-hmm.
had their difficulties not been misunderstood as
Yeah.
issues of,
Mm-hmm.
cultural integration. And
Mm.
so, something like delayed language development. There's all sorts of mythology around bi
Mm,
and multilingualism, and that
Mm.
this
yeah.
causes, you to have delayed speech
Yeah.
or, way back in the day was that it could even cause intellectual disability. And so
Well,
there's all kinds of alternative explanations that may
Mm-hmm.
have been given. Oh, these are dual language learners, and so they're having
Mm-hmm.
difficulty
yeah,
because of this, insert cultural reason.
Yeah.
Um,
yeah,
or, there was some confusion and not picking up the language, which actually might be better attributed to auditory processing issues.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
oh, yeah,
there's again, like, oh, the cultural reasons became the predominant reason why the
Yeah.
person was struggling. Oh, they don't have friends because they're having trouble socially integrating. They
right,
are
Mm-hmm.
strongly connected to the culture of whatever country. And I mean,
Yeah.
another thing that they brought up is just whatever that country was also shifted
Of
depending on the
course.
circumstances. So
right,
sometimes it might be, oh, because this, student came from the US, and sometimes it might be because they, spent time in France. And so it can also shift
hmm,
depending on what it is that the person
Mm-hmm.
using it wants it to do or wants it to explain. And
Yeah.
so I think there was a general sense of being lost because it was much simpler to explain their struggles on the fact that they just weren't culturally fluent or linguistically fluent,
Mm-hmm.
and that all it was going to do is take more time. Now, what I think is really interesting is that they learned to use that to their advantage, which I called cultural camouflaging, which
Mm-hmm.
is that they really leaned into the idea that when they were not doing something deemed socially appropriate or they
Mm-hmm.
were experiencing struggles of some sort, that there was almost a social shield that was allowed to them if they played up their foreignness.
right,
And I think that
right,
that's a really interesting
yeah,
phenomenon,
Yeah.
yeah,
um,
very interesting indeed.
because then you can sidestep some of the stigma. And I mean, I also want to acknowledge that this depends on your other identities as well, because it may or may not work to your advantage, depending, like one of
Mm-hmm.
my participants, you know, referring to being an Algerian in France is going to have a much different response than leaning into
Yes,
the
yes,
US
there are
side of that
historical
cultural
Of
reasons.
disadvantage.
course.
Yeah,
So,
Yeah.
I want
yeah,
to
Yeah.
say that this might not be a strategy that works in all cases across all identities
yeah,
and
Mm-hmm.
all environments, but that there appears to be a very specific adaptive strategy, which is to lean into the cultural ambiguity to create a kind of pressure valve. And I like to think about this as a form of masking without the cognitive load of masking. Because what you've done is you've
Mm-hmm.
externalized it to the observer, and you're
yeah.
just
Yeah.
allowing them to do the masking on
To
your
do the masking
behalf.
for you.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
brilliant
And
when you
Pass
do
it
so
that.
I
over to
think
the other
that
side.
there are some protective mechanisms in
Yeah,
there,
Yeah,
even though that sense of, ambiguity also has its own
of
issues.
course.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
interesting. So moving
yeah.
on to theme two, then. Theme two is destabilizing transitions. You kind of get a sense by the title, but why don't you explain us a little bit how you viewed this theme?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't think anybody is going to be surprised by the idea that transitions were really difficult for autistic
Not
DCKs.
really.
Um, and we know that transitions are difficult. This is another kind of comment that I regularly got was like, okay, but transitions are difficult for all TCKs.
Yeah,
I
of
say, yeah, but
course.
there's something like very palpable about the intensity in which these
Yeah,
transitions were disruptive. You know,
Mm,
everybody is going to have a period of adjustment when you move into a new space. But,
mm,
imagine when you are used to, eating the same foods over and over again, and then you move
Yeah.
to a new environment, you no longer have access to
Yeah.
those safe foods. That's extremely destabilizing. One of the
And
participants
you
talked
mean
about,
like really, you mean really when you get down to like food sensitivity issues, right? If you're thinking about, it's not just preferences, right? You're talking about the
yeah,
fact
I
that
mean,
Mm.
the food
like I can't
sensitivity,
eat
it
this
can
type
also
of food
be
and
a
right.
facet of executive functioning.
Oh
Sometimes it's
yeah.
just that um, I know exactly what I'm going to eat. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to. So
Yeah.
it can
Yeah,
Yeah.
also
yeah,
be a
okay, okay.
mechanism for kind of
Okay.
managing anxiety or stress. And
Mm.
you
Right.
have
Mm.
certain things,
Okay.
and sometimes it is just sensory processing, whereas I cannot eat that.
Yeah.
Right.
And so, you have both realities
Gotcha.
there, which I
Yeah.
think are totally legitimate.
Mm.
Things
Mm.
like, because a lot of TCK families, when they're moving, the cost of moving everything that you own is going to be very prohibitive. And so you offload a lot of your items. Now we know that a lot of
Yeah.
autistic people have special interests or have attachment to objects, more likely to anthropomorphize
Mm.
inanimate
Yes.
objects. And so
Yeah.
it might be really devastating to them that you have to leave your stuffy behind in a
Mm.
Yeah.
way that maybe you wouldn't have
Or
if
some
you
part of a
weren't.
collection of some sort, or
Yeah,
yeah.
or
Yeah.
suddenly being in an environment where maybe the textures of the clothing that you are wearing are
Yeah.
different.
Found that
Or, I
interesting
mean,
Yeah.
as
and even
well.
Wow.
thinking about
That's
like
that's so deep,
environmental
man.
changes, which,
Yeah.
when I do personal work with, students, particularly autistic students who are thinking
Mm.
about making the transition into higher education, I have an entire worksheet on what is that environment like? How is that going to change the clothing that you're wearing?
Mm.
Yeah.
Are you going to have to put on a wool sweater to stay warm?
Yeah,
Are you
yeah.
going to be able to deal with that
Yeah.
nine
How's
months
the
out of the
lighting?
year?
Right.
How is the light going to impact you?
Yeah.
How is the
Yeah.
Yeah.
weather going to impact you?
Yeah.
Because I think that that's a really important thing that I got out of this is that those, the sensory intake is
Mm.
extremely overwhelming
Yeah.
Yeah.
and that this can take a very long time to adapt to. Now,
Mm.
alternatively, some of my participants really described this in the later sections of the paper as giving them a broader toolkit to pull
Yeah.
from
For
and,
cope to cope. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, a larger inventory of
Mm.
things that maybe they had a more diverse diet because they had to pick a different same food in
You
every
just have
country
to,
that they
right.
were going to.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
And
Yeah.
yeah.
so they do get, they find ways to work it in and to
Mm.
draw benefits from those things as well.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Or yeah. And then the third theme, coping and collapse. Very descriptive. You conceptualize the special interests and also masking. You've mentioned that before a few times as both protective and also risky. So can you explain what these two things are? Actually explain masking and the special interest and why you found that they're risky.
Yeah. So masking is something that we have a lot of discussion about. This is a camouflaging strategy. It's a
Mm-hmm.
way of, compensating for the difficulties that you're having so that other people perceive them less. And, we can be more or less successful at masking.
Mm-hmm.
But what we do know is that that can become very overwhelming, very tiring, and that this correlates with higher rates of, burnout. Autistic burnout is
Mm-hmm.
a relatively new concept, kind of draws from the idea of professional burnout, but is really something distinct,
Mm-hmm.
where there are lots of, physical responses, physical illness, um, mental health consequences. There's kind of a full body experience of just simply shutting down. And there
Mm-hmm.
is some research that connects this also with increased suicidality, which is what
Mm-hmm.
I heard in the stories of my participants,
Yeah.
who almost all had incidents of being hospitalized either for suicidal ideation or as a result of suicide attempts. And
Yeah,
it
I
was
found that
really
very,
just,
very disturbing.
yeah, not
Yeah,
being
Yeah.
able to keep up
yeah,
with the demand.
yeah. Getting to
Something
that
else,
breaking point, right? Yeah,
yes, and
yeah.
something else that I picked up on with some of the participants was a decision fatigue. And I think
Mm,
that that can also be tied to masking in the sense that,
mm,
you know, you're going into an environment. I used to always say, like, I don't understand how people are socializing with each other. Like, my brain is going nonstop. And it was just like, okay, you're overthinking. And I was like,
Yeah.
no,
yeah,
I'm processing data.
yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
trying to figure out like what is the facial expression that I'm supposed to be making? What is the response that I am supposed
Mm,
to
Yeah.
be giving to this? What does my
mm,
body language say? And so you're constantly in a state of self-monitoring,
yeah.
um,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
and making decisions about right things that other people aren't really thinking about because they came, we're driving manual and
Yeah,
they're in an
Yeah.
automatic, and so they don't
Yeah.
have
They're in
to
the
think
flow.
about the
Yeah.
gear
yeah,
switch.
yeah,
Um, and eventually, I think there is a cognitive cost to this.
yeah.
Oh, there has to
Um,
be, of course. Yeah.
and so that, you know, can lead to all sorts of really negative impacts. And I
Mm-hmm.
do really want to emphasize that, the autistic community is at a significantly higher risk for suicide. Some statistics even at like up to 13%
Oh.
or
Mm.
13 times more than the general population.
Mm, mm,
And so, this is something that we want to be cognizant of in an already vulnerable population. And I
yeah.
think that Crossman and Wells, the work on adverse childhood experiences
Yeah.
is
Mhm.
also really important here because we already know that TCK is a vulnerable population to having these adverse childhood experiences. And
Mm,
we know that those come with all sorts of physical and mental health issues.
mm,
And now we have this added component. And so when we miss those young people,
Mhm.
then we're not able to help them develop, other coping strategies or other ways of soothing or figuring out how to tend to themselves to avoid burnout, and also to maybe reduce the likelihood that they are ruminating, and having this
mm,
suicidal ideation or making
Mhm.
actual attempts on their own lives.
yeah.
Mhm.
So special interests, really interesting. Were a soothing tool. So
Yeah.
everyone described these as their lifeline.
Yeah.
And oftentimes these get described as obsessional, and
Yeah.
it's an annoyance to other people because you bring every
Yeah.
topic
You're
back
obsessed
to
with
the
this stuff.
same
Yeah.
subject, or you're collecting all sorts of
Mhm.
paraphernalia around your special interest. And it can be like, okay, you've got to branch out. But actually, what they were saying is that this gave them a sense of stability, grounding, consistency, even in the spaces where their physical environments are changing.
Mm,
Yeah.
Having access to their special interests
yeah.
and there's one participant who describes it as sort of the stool, the legs of
Yes.
a stool,
Yeah.
and you have your kind of social network, and then I love that she says art and
Yes,
music
me
Mhm.
or
too.
sport,
Yeah.
Mhm.
like so
Yeah.
that these things are like fundamental to
Yeah.
um our existence as humans. And then the special interests, and if you cut access to that, you're actually removing the stability and creating insecurity.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so this was especially difficult for participants whose special interests are the culture that they're
Yes.
living in. And
Yeah,
when
Yeah.
of
they move out of
course.
that culture and then suddenly they no longer have as much access
Mm,
to it, that this could be enormously destabilizing. So I think finding ways to bring their special interests into the new environment might help ease the transitions a bit
Yeah.
and create
mm,
that sense of still being connected to something, still having control over
yeah.
something, And really that this needs to be encouraged rather than discouraged, because it does, in the way that my participants here have described it. And again, this not being anything that we can make sweeping generalizations about, but that we see that consistently it's showing up as this kept me alive.
Yeah. And you know what? I can confirm that, because I had one client and she was very interested in culture. So they were about to move and we focused then the sessions on the new culture she was going into. And that made it so much easier for her. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, especially for participants whose special interest was language, that was like a major protective factor, because they're okay, let's go, new language system. And this
Here we go.
increases your ability to socialize. It increases your access to things that are otherwise inaccessible to you. And so I think that's, you know, and there's some wonderful research as well by Bérenger Dillard, who is at Edinburgh, who's looking at cognitive flexibility in neurotypical versus autistic populations. And I think that there is some, you know, building evidence out there that actually multilingualism is a good protective factor for anyone. And so, you know, there, again, like a lot of mythology around autistic people not being able to acquire language or struggling with language, a lack of multilingual AAC devices, so that if you're a part of the non-speaking population, you're really forced into monolingualism. But that if we made, you know, language more accessible to the population, we might also be equipping them with protective factors.
For listeners and watchers, you just said AC devices. I believe you mean accompanied communication devices. Is that what you mean? Is that the word? Assisted?
It's the, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm forgetting the acronym, but it's augmented communication.
Augmented communication.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, so essentially this allows individuals who do not have the ability to produce their own, or, you know, maybe choose not to produce their own speech, can use these devices to help them connect and express themselves. And so I think it's also important, you know, if you're growing up across multiple cultures, that you also have the ability to use the languages from those cultures.
Yeah, so if those tools are very limited in terms of the language they can accommodate, that's an issue, right? Very interesting. Yeah. So theme 4, you labeled late diagnosis of autism. So we're assuming that participant told you about the fact that they were, you know, lately diagnosed and what that meant to them. Can you tell us a little bit more about the things they wanted you to know about, basically?
I mean, unlike the first theme, which is really about the things that inhibited them from being diagnosed, this was more about the personal impact on them of not receiving their diagnosis until later in adolescence or adulthood. And really, you know, there's a lot of studies now that are on this, you know, personal understandings of the diagnostic process and how they were impacted by that and how it affected them after the fact. And so again, all of this is really consistent with general stories that people are telling about late diagnosis and how they were impacted by that. I think what was particular to TCKs in this instance is that it also was this process of pulling apart and really dissecting what is my experience of being a TCK and what is autism, and, you know, can those, you know, like, are those two things antagonizing each other? Maybe this behavior that I have is because we're moving all the time. And again, you know, we now have more research on adverse childhood experiences. And I think, again, this is really a space where we might be wanting to look at this for, you know, better differential diagnosis.
Mm.
So they are doing that. They're like,
They're
what
doing
is
that themselves. Yeah.
TCK? What is being traumatized by my family? What
Trying to make
is,
sense. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
and so there was this like dual sense of ambiguity about their lived experience and what is lack of belonging because I haven't been in the same space, for more than 3 years, or because I've been bouncing around from country to country, and what is because that's me in the space.
Yeah. Do I really have
Mm-hmm.
problems relating to people, or is it just the fact that I'm forced to move every time?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I mean, so one of the participants brings up how moving all the time meant there was no real consistent observer of her over
Right.
time.
Yeah.
And
Yes,
so
that's
Yeah.
that,
it. Yeah.
Except the
Yeah.
she's
family, right?
then trying
Yeah.
to make sense.
Yeah.
And of course, this is a complication of the diagnostic process in itself, is that we're asking for, okay, but who had observed you in childhood? And if you've
Yeah.
Yeah.
moved to,
Yeah.
two, three,
There's
four
no,
countries, and, then you might have breaks in that observation or contradictory
Mm.
testimony about it. Which isn't to say that the parents aren't these more consistent observers, but I think there's that general sense of like, okay, more than the people outside of my family, which again, a lot of
yeah.
them said, but my family is really weird too.
Yeah.
So like the idea that like
You should
maybe
see
there's
my
a really
dad.
strong genetic component to this,
Yeah.
Of
Yeah.
course,
and
yeah.
so families might not immediately identify that the behavior is
Right.
something that,
Because
that
it
we
fits
should
in the
be looking,
family
yeah,
zeitgeist,
because
so to speak. Yeah.
exactly. Um,
That's beautiful.
and then
Yeah.
I think the other participant, my male participant, this lone soul male participant, was really kind of similar to me, like a rejection of the, received the diagnosis earlier in life and was just like, no, I don't think so. I'm fine.
Mm.
I'm fine. It's just my messed up family moving all the time. And then
Yeah.
it was like,
Yeah.
okay, well, now I'm in the same place and I'm still having the same issues.
Yeah.
So that kind of finally being settled somewhere gave a sense of constancy in which they could then reflect on and
You can
observe
observe.
themselves and say, I
Mm.
Yeah.
actually think there may be something more going on here than
Yeah.
just, all of these aspects of the
Shifting.
TCK experience that are,
Yeah.
are, are a little bit more, I don't want to say like widely known, because I think TCKs in general are still quite
It's a very
Yeah.
niche thing.
understudied.
Yeah.
So
But
no.
in the literature, we have a much better idea of, kind of the ways that TCK are
Mm.
psychologically impacted.
Yeah.
But we don't really have that as much for when they have disabilities,
Disabilities.
neurodivergent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
yet, there comes your theme number 5,
Yeah.
where you said, well, not suddenly, you talk about autistic TCK advantages. So actually, that your participants felt autism could be an advantage of living internationally. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. That's
yeah,
interesting.
So again, going back to the idea that autistic TCKs are kind
Mm-hmm.
of a paradox or something that just inherently cannot exist, I
Yeah.
found that they really identified very strongly with the positive descriptions of
Mm.
TCK. And, we could say that that's because they're clinging to
Yeah.
positive descriptions, because on the autistic side, you would be receiving a lot of negative messaging, particularly from this predominantly deficit-based lens that we often talk about autism. But instead, they did describe themselves as immensely resilient. And I think that this really pushes back on the idea of resilience in general.
Mm-hmm.
We always talk about the protective factors and things that help a person
Yeah.
develop resilience. But then thinking about when, maybe there are people who are just holding on to more things. So
Mm.
it's not, if you have a mountain climber and the guides are carrying their backpacks, right?
Right.
Are we going to say they are stronger
Yeah,
than the individuals who are carrying their own backpack up the
their own
hill
background.
just because they
Yeah,
got to the summit faster? Right.
yeah.
So I think resilience also needs to be contextualized with what is being experienced by that individual and what is
Mm,
it that they are, you know,
yeah.
overcoming or coping with that is also impacting them. And so the participants viewed themselves as highly resilient, and also very adaptable. And,
Mm,
again,
mm,
in terms of like limitations of the study, this could be because of selection bias, and that the
yeah.
people who participated in my study are people who have the
People.
greater experiences as TCK, and so we're more
Mm,
motivated to seek out being a participant in a study like this.
yeah.
So we have to
Hmm.
kind of bracket again that there
Just
might
the
be
fact of
other
reaching
reasons.
out and saying, yes, I will be part of a project
Yeah.
asks a lot of like executive functioning as well. Yeah. So
Already.
there's
Yeah,
Yeah.
that
and then
Yeah.
looking
self-selection
at the
possible
fact that
bias. Yeah.
everybody in my study is, has a higher education, which doesn't
Right,
mean that
right,
it
right,
was
right, right.
easy. Like I have
No, of
good
Yeah.
course
Yeah.
not.
days, but it wasn't easy for me to do
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
because there were
Yeah.
other things that I was grappling with at the same
At the
time.
same time.
Mm,
Yeah.
And so they might have happened at, the milestones might look different, or they might happen at different times, but they were still there. And that's really what the participants were focused on. And then again, that they just were provided with a kind of richer life world, that they felt that, being forced into these new environments um, pushed them to have to develop all of these coping skills. And
mm,
some of them say, okay, but being a TCK requires masking, just like being autistic requires masking. And so they almost conceptualize this differently. It wasn't like, they're still
mm,
doing it to fit in, but maybe not so much feeling like that deprives them of their
Hmm.
selfhood. So one of them
yeah.
is describing like it's just like putting on filters. This is my
Yeah. I
Chinese
like that.
persona.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
my Czech persona. This is my
Yeah.
Australian persona.
Hmm.
And so there was more fluidity there. So it's maybe a
Mm,
more fluid selfhood, rather than an absence of selfhood. Even though we do
Hmm.
get
Hmm.
that too, there is a sense in which when you are so focused on just trying to, and I always like to emphasize that masking is a survival strategy. It's an
yeah.
adaptive strategy to avoid isolation, rejection, to keep you tied to your community. Like it is,
Mm,
in a sense, very life or death
yeah.
in that
Hmm.
if you're not doing it, you increase your vulnerability. So
Mm,
I think, there is lots that we can kind of break down in that experience, but then being able to lean into the TCK identity there made it feel less costly,
Yeah.
less
Yeah.
mm,
stigmatized to be doing
Hmm.
it, because it was just like, oh, this is just cultural adaptation. Or
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
adaptation, like
It
I'm just,
reinterprets it a bit. Yeah.
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 Um,
Interesting.
Yeah.
yeah. And then, like I said, my James, the male participant, first of all, just like his memory was, I had to do so much redaction because it was like giving me every street and the floor of the house that he was on and all the names of his classmates and his
That's
teachers. And I was just like, oh my
incredible.
God. Like, but I mean, he was just like an encyclopedia of knowledge on his own life.
Uh-huh.
And I really
Wow.
liked when he kind of was like, I never really understood why everybody seemed to be struggling so much with the
Right.
Chinese
Yeah.
characters, but that was easy for me. It was just like, okay, because his long-term memory was
Yeah.
incredible.
Yeah.
And so it's easier for him to adapt and integrate in some environments because of that. And I
Yeah.
also, he was the one who also mentioned that, you know, moving abroad is a very difficult thing. And maybe autistic people are suited to this in some regard because we're very persistent. And
Right,
so there
right.
was no option except for
Yeah.
staying and
We're
figuring it
used to
out.
being abroad at home.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And
Stick
I
it
mean, I
out.
love that one of the participants says, like, there was a way in which I felt like an alien, and then there
Yeah.
is a way in which I am an
An
alien.
Yeah,
And
alien.
so
Yeah.
it's,
Yeah.
like
yeah.
we're navigating those dual realities at the same time.
Fantastic.
You're inhabiting two senses um,
Mm.
Yeah,
of a construct
yeah.
simultaneously.
So
Yeah.
you've really opened a door of research there that more people need to go through and explore that corridor and go down those
Mm-hmm.
stairs into the basement and into the attic and so on to continue
Left and
my
right.
bad metaphor about a hotel somehow. Um, so last questions. My last question. I don't know why I'm putting S's on everything today. Um, I give you, I don't know, $50,000, and I say you need to study one thing about this that you consider is the most important question future researchers should explore for now. What is that thing? What are you, how are you spending those funds? No, I don't want a full budget report. But
Not today, at
what I
least.
mean is yeah, is what are you doing? What do you think is the study that should be the next big thing in terms of that?
Hmm. I've never, I guess this says something about my own imagination. I've never imagined somebody just handing me a large budget to do whatever
Right,
I
right, right,
want.
And
right,
that's
right.
also fictional, right? Please.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
Just
so
saying.
I would really love to do research that we can draw more conclusive conclusions from, so
Yeah,
doing some experimental design, maybe trying to get a look at um, how many students in these international environments are displaying these traits. And
Mm.
then
right.
maybe
So
we can look
first
a
of
little
all,
bit
just
more
yeah,
closely at what's going on there, what's the story. And again, it could be that we're underdiagnosing in these populations. It could be that a lot of things that TCKs experience also show up and manifest in ways that
Mm.
can be convoluted with autism. So I
Yeah.
think it's really important for us to actually do some work into identifying, right? And maybe we don't say for sure they're autistic, but who has enough traits that they should be going through a diagnostic process? And then
Mm.
yeah,
what can we do from there? I also kind of fantasize about expanding the project and getting more people to speak about their personal experiences, um,
Mm.
what is important to them, just so that
yeah,
we have a richer kind of repository of what are the questions that this population is asking about, what are the things that are important and valuable for them to know, what is going to
yeah,
help
Mm.
their quality of life. And I think that the best way to do that is through really dynamic, rich, qualitative research. So I think
agreed.
it has to be a kind of dual effort. One, having the sexy numbers that will
Hmm.
get we can quantify what we're
Yeah.
looking at, and we can, create the economic justifications for why we need to invest in those. And then I think there's also that really human side and just bringing to light more of these stories and
Mm.
the ways that people have been influenced and impacted and shaped by them. And I think about it in terms also because, like I said, I work in higher education, and so I'm always thinking about the students who are studying abroad, students who are, doing their university in a foreign country, so international students who might not be traditionally TCKs. I mean, the environment that I'm in now is like most of the students have two, if not three passports. So
Or
I
at
Wow.
feel like
least
a
cross.
lot of
Yeah.
international
Yeah.
education, like we have these,
Mm.
we know that we have these. I think that we also know that people who seek out experiences of going abroad are more likely to have mental health conditions.
Mm.
Hmm.
And so maybe we need to start scratching at that. And I think the
Yeah,
Mm.
assumption has always been, oh, well, these are people who are looking to go sort of, you know, reinvent themselves in a place, and maybe that's part of the story. But maybe it's also that there's all of those great traits that we think, high empathy, curiosity, increased perspective taking. Maybe those are positive traits that are associated with neurodivergence, and those people are motivated to voluntarily go abroad. And motivated to bring their children abroad.
Yeah. Oh,
I
wow.
think that's
Yeah.
worth looking into.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So I think that would be $50,000 well spent.
Will you spend the money on Brooke then, Mathieu?
So we need to review the TCK podcast budget.
Okay, we do that. We
Brooke,
do that after the show. After the show.
after the show. Brooke, it's been wonderful having you on. Thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about this very important kind of intersection of two identities in this very important world. And I think I know quite a few listeners who will very much resonate with this because they are either on the autism spectrum themselves or are caring for autistic kids, whether it be their own or people that they see in their practice or part of their extended family. And so I think it's a really important thing. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
All right.
Thank you, Brooke.
All right, folks. We'll see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the TCK Research Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. Please subscribe, like, and share our podcast and leave us a review. It really helps others find us. If you have any questions or comments, please write to us at tckresearchpod@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you, and we promise we'll answer all emails. We wish you a good day wherever you are, and we hope you'll join us again for the next episode.